In 1961, the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man to go to space. The very same year as that monumental achievement, a Polish science fiction writer named Stanislaw Lem published a book about a strange meeting with an alien being on a planet covered almost entirely in water, an ocean that scientists believe is a single thinking organism. A team of scientists work on an orbital to watch and study this strange creature, but as they do so, they start to lose their minds, their connection to reality, and their will to ever return to Earth, all in the name of science. As the world celebrated the triumph of scientific progress, Lem wondered if we were truly ready for what might be waiting for us out there in the universe, and he wrote a novel that asks these questions. That novel was Solaris. Solaris was adapted 3 times by 3 different filmmakers, and all of the films have their own take on its themes, its questioning of our ability to truly understand reality, the invisible barriers and limitations of human cognition that stay with us, even as we travel through the galaxies, through worlds and centuries. The world is very different now from what it was 2,000 years ago. But I'm not sure that we are. Human beings still want the same things they always have, still need the same things we always have: food, shelter, homes, friends, love, companionship, music, beauty. We aren't the first people to feel lost in the world, and we won't be the last. It's become clear in just the last 4 years that not all so-called advances in science or technology are good. Some of them make life worse, make the world a worse place to live in. But however things change in the years to come, what won't change will be the underlying rawness and messiness of the human race. If we survive the mess we're in today, and even if we do end up going to space, we will bring our baggage with us. This isn't just the story of one classic science fiction book and 3 film adaptations of varying quality. It's a story about our dreams and aspirations as a species, our wish to be something bigger than just one mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. That dream is a very old one, probably as old as the knowledge that there are other worlds out there, but it's fair to say that for most of human history we haven't had a great estimate of the scale of the universe or the sheer randomness of Earth's place within it, and, well, even now we're limited to just the part of the universe that we can observe. It's just part of being human, looking at a distant shore and wondering, what could be over there? Can we build a tower that reaches all the way to the heavens? But before we start with the high-concept sci-fi and dreams of colonizing the galaxies, it might help us all to just take a reality check and make sure we're all on the same page. See, Solaris, the novel, was first published in 1961 as the space race was kicking into high gear, but space travel was still in its infancy. Things are certainly much more advanced now, but compared to the fiction that we're talking about today, we're still only taking baby steps in rocketry and especially manned spaceflight. Those private space travel stunts for millionaires are just that, stunts. I think that outside of breathless media hype, most people are well aware that the technology required to fulfill fantasies like terraforming other planets and colonizing Mars are about as realistic as wizards and balrogs. Remember that it took literally millions of years for the Earth's atmosphere to form through the complete accident of photosynthetic bacteria that lived in the ocean, pumping the atmosphere full of oxygen, and it took millions of years more for the ozone layer to form organically. Never mind the principle of tyranny of the rocket, that the mass of rocket fuel needed to achieve escape velocity by necessity outweighs what you're sending into space, and that adding more fuel means you have to add more mass, which means you have to add more fuel to carry that extra mass, and so on and so on. Now, admittedly, I'm not a rocket scientist, but hey, video essays aren't rocket science. I think the media during the 2010s was so hungry for a story about man reaching the stars and the sun that it underestimated both how far away Mars is and how difficult it is both to get there in the first place and much more so to actually sustain life on another planet, if such a thing is even possible. A guy sitting in front of a bookshelf. This is old school YouTube. So Solaris is an interesting story to talk about because the story of Solaris is very much about the idea that humans don't really change. Human beings are basically the same thing throughout history, throughout all of time. So 1,000 years in the past, 2,000 years in the past, 1,000 years in the future, the basic substance of what we are doesn't change. No matter how much our technology changes, no matter how much our understanding of the world, the universe changes. And that could be kind of an uncomfortable realization in a way. There's been a lot of kind of collective fantasizing about this notion that we're going to go and start terraforming other planets and we're going to go colonize the solar system. And there's something kind of tragically ironic about that because according to the narrative that we have been sold, the reason that we even need to do that in the first place is because we have ruined the planet that we already have, and so we therefore need to repeat our mistakes. The solution to the problems we face on Earth is to copy and paste them to somewhere else. There's something very human about that for sure. So the book is about this researcher named Chris Calvin who goes to an orbital to investigate a planet inhabited by a single organism, a sentient ocean, and that planet is called Solaris. Now, it is mentioned in the novel that people who get close to the ocean might get these psychological side effects. That's mentioned quite early on, but the actual conflict in the novel is not that the ocean is a threat to humanity, it's an ocean, what's it going to do? The problem is that the ocean doesn't want to talk to us. It's not interested in communicating with us. So when humans first show up, the ocean kind of reacts to them a little bit. It reacts to the measuring devices that the scientists or the probes or whatever the scientists are using to try and analyze the ocean. But then after a certain point it just stops. It doesn't react anymore. It just kind of ignores us. And maybe that's because from the point of view of the ocean, we just aren't that important, right? The ocean is reacting to humans as though they were weird little insects that are poking at its surface, and the ocean is so much bigger than us. And so much older than us that to it, we're just weird little pests, or just something it barely notices, that's too small even for it to think worth paying attention to. And so, it might be that it just kind of goes back to doing whatever it is that sentient oceans do with their free time, experimenting with different tidal systems or something. I don't know. So when the novel starts, scientists have already been studying this thing for decades, and that they have made an entire field of study around studying this one planet called solaristics. They've documented every single material fact they could find about the ocean. They have analyzed all the tiniest changes in the chemical composition of the ocean's surface. They've analyzed everything about the way it moves. They've analyzed everything about the orbit of the planet. They've got all these clinical details about the ocean that are just not really of much use, because the goal of actually establishing some kind of relationship or like some line of communication to the ocean is still shut off. And so it's kind of at a dead end. And Chris Kelvin compares the study of solaristics to medieval scholasticism. Medieval scholasticism, if anyone doesn't know, is or was a way of doing theology, a way of trying to systematize our understanding of God and our understanding of the divine by basically filtering the Bible through the work of ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, and trying to use their metaphysics and their classification systems to like give this rational explanation for the divine and explain how God works in like a very minute sort of way. And that was later kind of ridiculed and criticized as like building encyclopedias worth of junk, because, well, humans compared to the divine are like so far below ever understanding how God works that, like, why are we even trying? All this is to say, Chris Kelvin thinks that the study of solaristics has got, like, theological in nature. He kind of makes fun of the fact that a lot of people, and even some scientists, have kind of started treating this ocean as a god, precisely because it's a mystery. It's become a cosmic yogi, in the words of Chris Kelvin. So we've kind of been cosmically negged by the ocean into elevating it to the status of godhood. So scientists are at a loss. They don't know how to communicate with this thing, and their solution is to start bombarding it with radiation. And in response to that, the ocean starts giving the scientists on the orbital that is, like, orbiting around the planet, watching it. And the scientists on the orbital start getting horrific nightmares. And then they start getting visitors. The ocean sends people from their memories, or at least like simulacra of human beings that have like a physical reality to them, and they show up and they start, they just reappear. And in the case of Chris Kelvin, that is his dead wife. Again, we're doing another story with a dead wife, not on purpose. Another story with a simulacrum of a man's dead wife. This is not, I'm not trying to do Silent Hill again, but that's kind of where we've ended up, not deliberately. Anyway, he's very unsettled by this. He gets the feeling that the ocean is playing mind games with the crew, and so we have traumatized the ocean by what we've done to it, and the ocean is now kind of traumatizing us right back by reaching into the deepest recesses of our brains and pulling out the things that we don't want to think about. So Lem, I think, he's commenting in a very interesting way on how human beings react to things that are unlike ourselves, to things that are mysterious to us, things that we don't understand. And in this case, the thing that the scientists do when they are at a loss for how to understand the ocean is they start hitting it, right? They start basically attacking it. And Lem was concerned with, so there's like obviously a colonial element to this, that the ocean is this thing that refuses to be colonized, that refuses to be incorporated into like a human-centric view of the universe, and so it is then attacked. So, as I said, the ocean isn't a threat, but its existence we find difficult to tolerate, because we don't like the fact that something that we don't understand can exist out there in the universe, and so we try to colonize it. The ending is basically that we give up, that human beings, or at the very least Chris Kelvin, gives up on understanding this thing. and the final passage of the book is him looking at the ocean and basically admitting, like, we will never understand this. He's confronted by just the silence of the ocean in despair that it has all been for nothing. Cheerful ending. Cheerful book, cheerful ending. So the Tarkovsky movie isn't the first film adaptation of Lem's Solaris. There was also a 1968 TV movie version, which in cinematic terms shows its age a lot more than the Tarkovsky version, but it certainly has its charms. The 1968 version clearly had a much smaller budget. It's shot in a small handful of visibly cramped sets, and almost nothing is actually shown of the ocean. It's a little more like Solaris the play than it is Solaris the movie, very pared down and very dialogue heavy. We're going to mostly skip over it though, because the feature film version, the one that basically defined this book visually for most people, was released 4 years later in 1972 and has largely eclipsed the 1968 version. But before we move on, there is one other interesting thing to note about the 1968 TV version. The relationship between Chris Kelvin and his dead wife Hari, and his guilt over the fact that she died by suicide years before he came to Solaris, is the emotional core of it, and the mechanics of the ocean are largely absent. I'm sure those of you who haven't read the book have already picked up on this, but I need to labor this point because it's going to come up a lot. Lem just isn't particularly interested in Chris Kelvin's grief or guilt over his dead wife or the romance between them or any of that. In the novella, Chris Kelvin's wife, Hari, is largely just a plot device designed to show that the ocean understands us more than we understand it, and that in our attempting to understand it, the ocean simply holds up a mirror to us. He doesn't really care about Kelvin and Hari as individuals. The book spends a lot more time explaining the painful and frustrating process of the scientists' efforts to understand the ocean, whereas the films are all going to be a lot more interested in the human relationship between Kelvin and his wife. And I'm sure Stanisław Lem is going to absolutely love that.
I called the book Solaris, not Love in Outer Space.
So we all had a very good laugh in the last video about bad adaptation choices and how the filmmakers ruined the Silent Hill games and all of that good stuff. But I have to confess at this point that I actually prefer the 1972 Tarkovsky film over Stanislaw Lem's original novella. Now, that's not to say I don't have great respect for Lem as a writer, that I don't think he's an incredibly funny and smart and prescient. The reason I really love this film and why it really speaks to me is because it is so hypnotic, so mesmerizing. So if you're anything like me, you may be hypnotized, mesmerized, just pulled straight into this movie from minute one all the way to the end. If you're not like me, you might be bored out of your skull. You might watch this and think, this is a snooze fest. I'm tired of these philosophical monologues, you know. Okay, so now let's talk about the 1972 Andrei Tarkovsky Solaris. The development of this movie is honestly pretty interesting. Tarkovsky at this point had made one successful World War II drama, Ivan's Childhood, about war as seen through the eyes of an innocent. His second feature, Andrei Rublev, was a 3-hour biopic of a medieval Russian icon painter who was considered one of the masters of the art form. Now, a 3-hour black and white Russian movie about a medieval icon painter might sound like a caricature of the types of film that only a pretentious film snob who spends 18 hours a day on Letterboxd would enjoy, but it is honestly pretty action-packed, with massive invading hordes and battle scenes and cathedrals ruined and wandering holy men and these massive spiritual reckonings. It's good. Watch Andrei Rublev. Problem was that the censors were not thrilled with it. They called it ideologically erroneous and anti-historical, and it was not allowed to take part in the official competition at the Cannes Film Festival in 1967. Other European countries screened it, but within the Soviet Union itself it was held back from a wider distribution. The net effect of all this was that Tarkovsky ended up making Solaris because, well, he needed the money. However, we also have to mention the elephant in the room, which is 2001: A Space Odyssey. Before Tarkovsky decided to adapt Lem's novel in 1969, he went to see 2001 and didn't like it very much. He felt that there was a certain coldness or sterility in that movie's vision of the future, a triumphalism about progress in a purely technological sense that didn't account for the human element, the possible alienation created by technological change. He pitched the idea to Mosfilm, which was then a state-owned production company, and they thought adapting Lem could be a decent moneymaker, a sure bet on a popular author. They actually ended up spending a lot of money on Solaris. It was at the time one of the most expensive films they had ever produced. These futuristic sets and rockets were not cheap to make, certainly not by the standards of Soviet cinema in the 70s. I'd wager it was considerably more expensive than Ivan Vasilievich Change's profession. Before the film was shot or cast, Tarkovsky met Lem at the Pekin Hotel in Moscow, and they had a very frosty tea party where it became clear that they had very different ideas about the project, but Lem, I suppose, got sick of arguing and told Tarkovsky to just crack on with it.
Tarkovsky and I had a healthy argument. I sat in Moscow for 6 weeks while we argued about how to make the movie, then I called him a durak and went home.
Even so, after he read the first draft of the screenplay, Lem actually threatened to basically pull the plug on the project if it wasn't rewritten. He thought there were way too many changes for him to support this project, and so he sent a letter to Mosfilm in 1970 to that effect.
I demonstrated to A. Tarkovsky that he, probably unintentionally, reduced the tragic conflict, biological and cyclical, resulting from social progress, generational changes, and also reduced the cognitive and ethical questions to the melodrama of a family squabble. They are not mentioned in the novel.
So Tarkovsky had to write another draft, and the result is an interesting fusion of Lem and Tarkovsky, leaning more heavily into the science fiction elements than Tarkovsky might have liked, but still less so than would have pleased Lem. Tarkovsky in later life claimed to not actually like science fiction. He said that he wished he could have made a version of Solaris that took place entirely on Earth, but I don't really buy that. The truth is that Tarkovsky, I think, was a little irritated that his two most popular and successful films, Solaris and Stalker, both fit inside the science fiction genre, and because he was, if we're honest, a bit of a film snob, he didn't like the idea of being a genre filmmaker. He didn't even like being compared to American blockbuster directors like Steven Spielberg, and was irritated if interviewers drew comparisons like that. And so that, I think, is why he sort of tried to distance himself from the science fiction genre, but I don't think he would ever have made a version of Solaris that was not science fiction. I mean, that just doesn't really make any logical sense. So, in effect, these two men, Stanisław Lem and Andrei Tarkovsky, who by all accounts didn't particularly like each other, still managed to complement each other artistically in a strange way. There was a problem though, because even then the censors were not thrilled with the new draft of the script. Their biggest problem, according to Tarkovsky's diary, was that they still felt the film was too religious in tone and that it presented too negative a view of science. They presented Tarkovsky with a list of 35 changes to the script that they would want to see before giving it the green light, with my favourite being, remove the concept of God. But somebody behind the scenes at Mosfilm, Tarkovsky claimed not to know who that was, pulled some strings, and the list of 35 demands was magically dropped. So finally, they could get to work. The Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa, who you might have heard of, actually visited the set of this movie during the production, and he made an interesting comment that Tarkovsky seemed to really love working on this film, that he was like a child playing with a toy box. So I'm sure you'll agree this is probably going to be a very fun, playful version of the story, right? Wait, is this religious music? I mean, okay, so various art house filmmakers have turned this specific tune into a cliche now, but J.S. Bach? This is music composed by an 18th century Lutheran about his struggles with faith and devotion, the sense of his sinful nature in the eyes of the divine, and his hopes for redemption? In a science fiction movie? It's almost as if that theme of the ocean as God from Lem's novella is coming back, but in a different way. Okay, so I should say right off the bat that Solaris is a very dense movie. It's full of conflicting ideas, abstruse references, philosophizing, Chekhov-style monologues. There's no way that I can actually explain every idea or concept in this movie without just playing the whole thing for you, or sitting here recording for the next 100 hours. But my goal here in this section is just to give a big picture idea of how I interpret this movie and why I love it so much, and why I keep coming back to it nearly 10 years after I first watched it. So the first thing everyone notices about the Tarkovsky version of Solaris, apart from the absolutely gorgeous colours, is that it's very slow. The book opens with Chris Kelvin getting to the orbital, with the only reference to his life on Earth being the fact that he's carrying the key to his apartment, whereas the first 45 minutes of the Tarkovsky movie all take place on Earth. The film begins with a Solaris veteran named Burton coming to Kelvin's house to ask if he'll go to the orbital to investigate whether they should end the Solaris mission, which he doesn't particularly want to do. We see Chris Kelvin in his beautiful garden, meet his family, see this guy Burton try to convince him to go back to the station, this beautiful still life picture of a ruined picnic representing regret and remorse, Chris Kelvin watching a videotape of Burton from the past explaining his encounter with the ocean, Burton reacting to his own testimony. Wow, this is just like YouTube, as he describes the trauma of the horrifying vision the ocean showed to him, the oversight panel watching the actual footage from the flight, Burton's report getting dismissed for being too outlandish despite the fact they're talking about an ocean that can think, Chris Kelvin staring forlornly at a picture of his late wife, the family squabbling over why Burton was invited in the first place, a visit to a horse in a barn, an argument between Burton and Chris Kelvin about science and morality, a reminder that science gives us atom bombs as well as spaceflight, remember Hiroshima, Chris Kelvin's parents watching a documentary about Solaris, introducing the last remaining skeleton crew of the orbital, a Skype call via TV screen, and finally several uninterrupted, largely silent minutes of tracking shots of roads in Japan. Chris Kelvin burning a bunch of his own papers and photos at dusk, followed by looking at the night sky he's about to travel to, and then finally the orbital over Solaris coming into view in the windscreen of Kelvin's spaceship. Now, since we're here, I do want to point out just how beautiful this shot is, just how eerie and quiet it is, just that rippling ocean getting closer and closer. The Japan part is a little harder to interpret, especially since it carries on for way longer than you expect, but I think it basically shows two things. The heavy after effects of exposure to the living ocean on Burton psychologically, and, well, the feeling of being far from home. So the upshot is that 46 minutes into this 3-hour movie, we are now chronologically on page 1 of the novella. Everything we just saw was a setup. This is where the actual plot begins. Now, Lem, I'm sure, would agree that while this is quite different from the novel, it's an important setup that gives us greater context to Chris Kelvin as a character, lets us relate to him a little more so we can be fully invested in his fate when he gets to the orbital.
And what was absolutely terrible was that Tarkovsky introduced Kelvin's parents and even some aunt into the movie, but most of all his mother. The mother is Russia, the motherland, Earth. That just enraged me.
So after all of that, the question that inevitably arises is this bad pacing? And quite honestly, I find it hard to imagine that any mainstream Hollywood director would ever do this today, especially where received wisdom says the audience's attention spans are fried, that many of us have literally lost our ability to watch a story unfold slowly and deliberately, to get lost in a mood and an atmosphere. And indeed, the 2002 version, we'll get to that, has a much tighter runtime at about an hour and 45 minutes. Funnily enough, that's partly why I love that Tarkovsky did it this way. I love the idea that movies can exist that play with the dimension of time in different ways that aren't geared solely towards maximum efficiency, towards optimizing the runtime, but have space in them to think, reflect, ponder. We need that now more than ever because the digital age is the age of distraction. But there's also another reason, a story reason, why it takes so long for this film to get started, and that's because Chris Kelvin just doesn't want to be the hero of this story. He's still tethered to Earth, still moored to it, and is maybe afraid that if he goes to Solaris, he might never come back. In other words, the thing Lem hates about this movie, the nostalgia for Earth, is one of the main things I like about it. Although I'm sure it is just a throwaway remark that he specifically mentions Mother Russia. I mean, it's not as if Poland and Russia have ever had a difficult relationship historically. So Chris Kelvin gets to the orbital, and at this point in the movie I got déjà vu from watching 2001. It seemed like these tracking shots, the circular architecture, the color scheme were all directly referencing the Kubrick movie, the long liminal hallways being a bit of a Kubrick signature, in fact. But there's a big difference. This place looks like it's showing some age, it's lived in, full of empty space, and more importantly, full of clutter. Which is not how real-life space travel works just yet. They don't tend to have these big cavernous corridors, given that, well, in space is at a premium, thanks to the tyranny of the rocket. But for this movie, it's exactly the right look. This is, after all, a ghost ship, peopled by a skeleton crew, a fraction of the size of the original crew. The other people on the orbital are distant, spacey, as though they're in the middle of a psychotic episode. Kelvin watches a video message by Gabarian, a crew member who we learn has died by suicide, warning him about the need to not lose his head. And then this happens. Welcome back, Inner Demons. Now the real plot begins. Congratulations, Chris Calvin, you've come all the way across the galaxy to an almost deserted space station, and suddenly here's your ex-wife. I want to emphasize, though, that this movie goes out of its way to show the wrongness of this encounter from the perspective of both Chris and Hari. The attempt to recreate romance, followed by Kelvin attempting to literally launch her into outer space because he's so afraid. Stanisław Lem thought that although this wasn't exactly how he had written about the relationship between Chris and Hari in the novel, it at least created an interesting cinematic tension between desire and horror, attraction and repulsion, the familiar and the alien, both between Chris and Hari and within themselves as individuals.
I did not write this novel about people's erotic problems in space.
Now, this film is not what I'd call erotic, but it is a little more erotic than the average Soviet film. I need to emphasize this point that Soviet cinema basically never shows sex, at least not until the big changes that swept through the Soviet film industry in the 1980s. So things don't actually get much sexier than whatever is going on here. Maybe the Gen Z Puritans that everyone's worried about just need to discover Mosfilm's back catalogue. They'll love it. You know, the romances are very, very chaste, you know. That said, the actual conflict here is not the erotic problems that Lem was so irritated by. It's actually the fact that Kelvin doesn't know if this visit from his late wife or the ocean's simulation of his late wife is a gift or a curse, a punishment or a blessing, damnation or salvation.
Ты меня любишь?
Ну что ты говоришь глупости, Харри? Кого-то не знаешь. Я сейчас уйду ненадолго. Ты подожди меня, ладно?
Tarkovsky's film is not Solaris, but rather Crime and Punishment. After all, in the film, this foul Kelvin drives Harry to suicide and is then tormented by remorse, which is strengthened further by her sudden reappearance, as well as the strange and incomprehensible circumstances that accompany it.
Now, in the book, it feels much more evident that the ocean is hurt by what the scientists are doing, that it lashes out in some form against us as a kind of resistance to our efforts to colonize it. But in the film, the possibility is kept open that maybe the ocean is doing the cosmonauts a favor, that from its standpoint it is giving them what they want, granting a wish to be reunited with people that they've lost. Which is why, joking aside, this is a very different kind of story from Crime and Punishment, or, well, Silent Hill 2. See, Crime and Punishment is a story about a man whose conscience is literally at war with him, who is convinced that he's going to get caught, who is kind of living in what he doesn't realize is the fear of God, right? And he slowly comes to realize over the course of the book that God is the one watching you. God is the one who's going to punish you, and you need to repent because otherwise, you know, your eternal soul is in peril, right? But the fact of Kelvin's guilt and remorse is really just one of a number of emotional complications that make it a greater struggle for him to understand the ocean's motivations, if it even has explicable motivations in the human sense of the term. It's something that adds ambiguity to the situation rather than being this question of crime and punishment. So, if I may be presumptuous for a moment, I think Lem actually got the main theme of this movie wrong. It's understandable, I think, because no one likes to see their own work be misrepresented, but the bigger theme of the Tarkovsky movie is actually a kind of cosmic homesickness, earth sickness, you might call it, a profound alienation in the face of a vast, cold universe. I'm reminded a little bit of the unfinished Octavia Butler Earthseed novel, where she wrote about the idea that people in outer space might be, it might feel like a missing limb, a phantom pain, No matter how hard you try to recreate the Earth, you ultimately can't do it, because something deep within us is telling you, this is wrong, you shouldn't be here. Obviously, she never finished that book, but the idea there is interesting. So this is about an encounter with the unknown that leaves us bereft of both the comfort and the warmth of the Earth, and the certainty that we are progressing towards something. So Chris Kelvin in this film has arrived at a scientific mission that is on its last legs, the crew on the brink of completely losing touch not only with Earth, but with reality. The character of Hari brings a kind of existential dread, a sense that some psychological continuity exists with Chris Kelvin's wife, that she has access to memories of Earth, but also knows she's never been there, like they are not spiritually the same person, but there is also a very strange connection between her and a person who has died. You can kind of imagine how weird that would be, right? But then the climax of the movie, if you can call it that, is not an Alien or Blade Runner style shootout with the bad guys, if they even exist. It's a spiritual debate in what looks more like a theological library than an orbital spacecraft. Just 4 lives as tiny and flickering as those 4 wax candles, each struggling in their own way for their own truth, for a version of this reality that makes sense to them. If anyone has watched my Silent Hill video and thought I was being over the top in praising that game, well, here's more hyperbole for you. I think this is one of my favorite scenes in a movie ever. Admittedly, I have a lot of favorite scenes ever. If we look at the construction of this set, there's a lot of elements that communicate things beyond what is actually said in the dialogue. There's a bust of Socrates, representing the limits to our understanding of the world, the man most famous for saying the only thing we can know is that we know nothing, and who himself wrote nothing that survives to us. There's a wall lined with the old master paintings, including none other than Bruegel the Elder's Tower of Babel. What better symbol than Babel, after all, for human hubris, for our belief that we can conquer the heavens? What more classic symbol than Babel for, well, incomprehension, for the unfinished, for the unknowable? So Snout, the birthday boy, they're having a little birthday party for him, asks Kelvin to read a monologue from Sancho in Don Quixote about the joy of sleep. Sleep here meaning, well, ignorance. Blank refusal to leave Earth and explore the cosmos. Does he think that ignorance is bliss? And remember, Don Quixote is a story about a quest that ultimately means nothing, a journey undertaken by a man living inside a delusion of his own making, and his squire Sancho, who enables his delusion every step of the way. Does Snout read this because he wishes they never came out to the stars, never tried to conquer other worlds? Does he think their quest is as hopeless as that of Don Quixote, a man who believes a barber's basin is an enchanted helmet, a windmill a giant, a Dominican friar an evil wizard? On the other hand, if we don't hunger to understand the universe, are we really human at all? It's a debate the movie never settles, that the characters never settle. I keep coming back again and again to the metaphor of Babel, the hopelessness of constantly reaching for the unknown. Despite this apparent cynicism, Snout, I think, is a humanist in the true modern sense. Everything he says is a plea for understanding between human beings, a reminder that without each other, perhaps we really are alone in the cosmos with forces beyond our control or understanding.
Человеку нужен человек.
After the debate in which Sartorius coldly tells Hari she isn't real,
Да вы не женщина и не человек, поймите вы наконец, если вы вообще способны что-нибудь понимать.
she attempts suicide, but the biology of creations of the ocean is clearly a little different, and the liquid oxygen that she drinks fails to kill her. If there's one flaw in this film from my perspective, it's that Hari's inner conflict isn't explored further independently of Kelvin's, that we can only see her as connected to him, and we can only see her struggle as it relates to him. But that said, it's clearly a load-bearing element of the drama. Without Hari's monologue in this film about becoming human and feeling deeply despite being only a copy, I don't think you get the tears in rain speech from Blade Runner.
Но я становлюсь человеком. Чувствую нисколько не меньше, чем вы.
Kelvin's brainwaves are beamed onto the ocean, and the ocean seems to change in character, seemingly responding to something that has taken place on the orbit. Kelvin falls into a delirious dream, and Hari asks the other scientists to destroy her, unable to cope with the inherent alienation of her own existence. Snout tells Kelvin that he can see islands on the ocean's surface, an ongoing metamorphosis that they still have no way to comprehend. So at the end of this film, it seems like science has won out over the deception of the ocean. But it's a Pyrrhic victory because in the end we don't conquer the heavens conquer us. Kelvin admits that even if he goes back to Earth, life will never be the same. He will never be the version of himself that he was before he came to Solaris.
А что дальше? Вернуться на Землю? Понемногу все войдет в норму, даже возникнут новые интересы, знакомства. Но я не смогу отдаться им до конца. Никогда.
And in the end we see him go back to his house on the hill, only for it to rain indoors, the rain of Solaris pouring down all around him, his existence an island on a planet made of vast, endless ocean. He chooses to live on in the world created for him by an unknowable being, instead of going back to that beautiful Earth that he left behind. Is that a surrender to an illusory world of illusory pleasures? An admission that there's nothing left for him on Earth? An act of pure self-indulgence? Is it an act of faith, a decision to believe in the god of the ocean, that believe that the ocean is benevolent, to give himself up to a power greater than himself, the way that Raskolnikov does in Crime and Punishment? Or is it the same idea as the book, a scientist embracing the unknown, admitting to himself that he might never understand the universe and trying to turn within himself instead? The film doesn't answer that question, and I think it's good that it doesn't. The answer is whatever the ending makes you feel. Lem, of course, was deeply moved.
My Kelvin decides to stay on the planet without the slightest hope, but Tarkovsky painted this sentimental picture of an island with a little house on it. When I hear about the island and this little house, my skin crawls with irritation.
This might seem obtuse on my part, but I really don't think that the themes of the book and the movie are as incompatible as a lot of other people seem to think. Lem wrote a novel about how we react to an entity that refuses to be understood and refuses to be colonized, a creature that ultimately assimilates its attackers, rewires their reality around itself. The ending of the film is either sentimental or horrifying, depending entirely on your point of view. But the cinematic language, the unsettling soundtrack, the strange image of the indoor rain is, let's say, much more ambivalent than Lem believes it is. The core of this movie is a confrontation with an entity that can't be understood, a mystery that's larger than the human mind, and the result is, depending on your point of view, either faith or surrender, a spiritual crisis wearing the clothes of science. So I don't love the fact that dealing with these chronologically means I have to tackle this one last, that Steven Soderbergh's 2002 remake is given the final word.
And I thought Tarkovsky's Solaris was bad.
I have a lot less goodwill towards Soderbergh given his use of AI slop to recreate dead celebrities, and while Andrei Tarkovsky certainly had many personal faults, he at least took the art and the craft of cinema very seriously, and I can only believe he would be appalled to see it tarnished by mindless tech rot. But I'm going to try to talk about this film on its own merits as best as I can, because I don't want to give the impression that I think there's something inherently superior about Russian movies versus American movies, or a law of the universe that says an old movie is always better than a new one. So, this movie was produced by James Cameron, whose production company Lightstorm bought the rights to Solaris from Mosfilm, who had held the rights since the 1970s. Cameron himself was originally slated to direct, which certainly would have made for a very different film had it gone ahead. Perhaps it would have involved the orbital hitting an iceberg on Solaris and sinking. In any case, Soderbergh pitched his own version to Cameron while he was working on his own film, Traffic. And Cameron, who was unable to direct the film itself because of scheduling conflicts, liked Soderbergh's vision and gave him the green light. Andrei Tarkovsky passed away in the 1980s as a result of radiation exposure from making Stalker. That's another story. But Stanisław Lem, who was still around but had no direct involvement in the 2002 film, was absolutely over the moon at the prospect of a fresh take on his most famous work for the first time in 30 years.
Solaris was submitted to the next year's Berlin Film Festival, and in Poland the film will be shown only after the festival is over. Polish distributors obtained a copy of the movie. However, I am not that eager to see it.
This movie is not terribly popular, and it bombed at the box office when it came out in 2002, but it does have a fan base, a little hive of contrarians who insist that this is not only a great science fiction film in its own right, but for a minority of them, actually better than the 1972 version. Now, to paraphrase dinosaur footprint expert Dan Olson, a lot of the time Hollywood remakes of non-English language films exist for two reasons: raw commercialism motivated by the knowledge that an existing movie has a built-in audience, and sometimes fanboyism, a desire on the part of the filmmakers to share a beloved non-American movie with the domestic audience who are supposedly unwilling to simply read the subtitles and engage with a piece of art on its own terms. Some of these are even quite beloved and acclaimed, like The Departed, but even the good ones have always felt a little redundant to me. The Departed, for example, is a retelling of infernal affairs that massively expands the runtime of the original movie, largely just to justify giving the story a different ending. But that to me isn't enough, nor am I really impressed by Scorsese cramming the cast full of big-name American Oscar winners, because Infernal Affairs already had pretty big-name actors attached to it. Still, Steven Soderbergh said himself he wasn't trying to remake the Tarkovsky movie, he was trying to re-adapt the book. That on its own kind of makes sense. It's not likely to reach the same heights as the Tarkovsky version, but a new film version that hews a little closer to the text might not be the worst idea in the world. It at least seems less blatantly ridiculous than, say, remaking Oldboy with Josh Brolin. And no, I haven't seen that Oldboy remake. I have some self-respect. Maybe, you might think, Soderbergh plans to make a film version that closely follows Lem's original vision, that brings to life the spectacle of the ocean, the struggles of scientific progress, the cyclical drama of humanity, as Lem put it. That sounds like an okay idea, or at least an interesting one. Trouble is that this movie is... well, it's not that. You want more? Alright then. First thing to say about the 2002 version is that it's very clearly first and foremost a romance.
I called the book Solaris, not Love in Outer Space.
It's maybe a little closer to something like The Fountain than it is to the original Solaris, a cosmic, galaxy-spanning quest to overcome the bounds of mortality and the transience of human life. We see a lot more of the romance between Kelvin and his wife, who in this version is named Rhea, with romantic musical crescendos, flashbacks to their life together on Earth, sex scenes, the works. In other words, this movie is telling us that the thing we should care about in this story, the element we should be investing all of our emotional energy in, is this relationship between the two characters. Now, to be fair to Soderbergh, although maybe he doesn't deserve it, there's nothing wrong with finding a new angle on the material. In fact, it's what you should do. Sadly, I just don't really see much of a reason to buy into this romance. I don't think Clooney brings a very convincing aura of being a tortured, conflicted soul, nor do I really see any internal conflict in the actress playing his wife, especially compared to what Natalia Bondarchuk brought to the 1972 version, nor is there really a lot of chemistry between the two leads, in my opinion. The performances are at times overdone and at times surprisingly flat. I'm not saying that either of these people are bad actors, but they do feel a little miscast in this particular story. We can nevertheless appreciate that we're now 3 for 3 on this. Every filmmaker who has ever touched this story has been drawn to the relationship between Kelvin and Hari as the emotional core, although they've presented it in very different ways. Tarkovsky presents it as this alienating, scary, and confusing encounter, but that is also kind of tempting in its own way. But they are all wrestling with various degrees of grief. They're torn between embracing and denying the gift of the ocean. And that honestly makes sense, because Screenwriting 101 says you need a conflict that we, the audience, can emotionally relate to. And for most people, the ghost of a dead wife is a bigger emotional problem than a roadblock in astrobiological research. Books, I think, also have more freedom to explore abstract ideas, to go out there into the conceptual space and kind of work through things. Whereas that's harder to do in a film, because a film is inherently, the storytelling in a film is inherently a product of what we can see on screen. But again, romance in movies still needs to give the audience a reason to care beyond just the simple fact that a romance exists. We need some sense of who these people are, why they love each other, or at least why they should be together, beyond just the demands of the screenplay. And while Tarkovsky certainly took a different philosophical approach from Lem, this movie largely just cuts the philosophy out altogether. The way that the creations of the ocean are in a sense alienated from themselves is largely ignored in this movie. The idea of communicating with the ocean or attempting to divine its motivations is undeveloped, only touched on in passing. Even comparing these secondary characters makes it feel like something is missing here. Snout is a memorable character in Tarkovsky's Solaris because he's desperate to cling on to the memory of Earth and not lose all ties to it. Here his equivalent seems more like a stoner in a marijuana-fueled haze. Whether that makes this movie worse in some objective sense is irrelevant. To me, it removes a lot of what makes Solaris interesting. I don't think Soderbergh shares Tarkovsky's ambivalence about technology and its relationship to humankind, but he also isn't very interested in Lem's themes of epistemology and colonialism, which leaves you with an adaptation of a philosophical novel without any philosophy to speak of. Visually, the movie is also underwhelming, both in terms of the orbital and the ocean. The look of it is very bland. It doesn't replicate the feeling you get from the 1972 movie that this place is sort of rusting away, that it's a lived-in but cluttered up piece of cosmic debris. In Tarkovsky's version, there's a feeling that the ocean is a character. There's this eerie feeling created by the Kuleshov effect of events on the orbital being juxtaposed with this mysterious, silent motion of the living ocean. Even fundamental things like the set design and the color palette are much duller than they are in the 1972 version. The science fiction aesthetic in Tarkovsky's movie was pretty unique and influential in its own right. I mean, look at the influence it had on Alien and Blade Runner, even compared to its own main aesthetic influence, 2001. Here it's largely generic and dull, with dull colors and commonplace designs. It echoes the Tarkovsky movie visually in certain ways, but doesn't add anything noteworthy of its own. Again, it brings me back to the sheer redundancy of this movie, the lack of justification for its existence, the failure to bring out the emotion in me that it clearly wants to. Think of Blade Runner, think of the 1972 Solaris, the emotional moments that are all the more impactful because of the dehumanizing, alienating surroundings in which they occur. Here, the orbital is, well, it's just a soundstage. Okay, let's talk about the ending. So in cinematic language, there's a fairly unambiguously happy ending, with Rhea telling Kelvin they don't need to worry about life and death, that all of their past mistakes are forbidden, that they're beyond the dichotomy of living and dying.
Am I alive or dead?
We don't have to think like that anymore.
The two of them embrace, and then the film fades to black. I don't hate the ending of this movie in and of itself, but I do think most of the actual scenes that make it up, the build-up to this point, are mediocre and forgettable. It's as if this is the answer to a question that the movie never really bothered to ask, satisfaction to a narrative arc that we never witnessed. There's certainly nothing on the level of the library scene in the Tarkovsky film, and it seems that even Lem finds something stereotypically American in the desire for a happy ending, the desire to avoid either the despair of the ending of the novel or the strangely off-putting ambiguity of the ending of the Tarkovsky film.
The Soderbergh movie supposedly has a different, more optimistic finale. If this were the case, this would signify a concession to the stereotypes of American thinking regarding science fiction. It seems that these deep, concrete ruts of thinking cannot be avoided. Either there is a happy ending, or a space catastrophe.
I expect some people in the comments might say I'm judging this movie more harshly because the Tarkovsky movie exists, that if this was the only adaptation we had of the book, maybe I would be kinder to it. But even if that's true, is that really an invalid consideration? Does the existence of a better adaptation not make us question whether the remake serves a worthwhile purpose? I'm not saying no one can ever adapt Solaris again, but it does feel like a crowded field at this point, and anyone trying to re-adapt the text will have to think carefully about what they're bringing to it that's new, what is their fresh take on the story. As it is, even on its own merits, I don't think this version is very good. I guess let's give it a grade. I guess I will give the 2002 Solaris a grade C. Middle-of-the-road movie with a decent ending and a few okay scenes. Let's see what Lem thinks.
The Americans, in a somewhat childish manner, grade films just like children's papers in school. Hence, there were critics who gave Soderbergh's Solaris an A. The majority agreed on a B, and some gave it a C.
Unlike with Silent Hill, it's not so easy for me to conclude this story because Solaris itself is a story without conclusions about the impossibility of getting all the answers that you want. When Lem was writing the novel, he was writing in an age of delirious optimism about space travel. where people really thought we were going to the stars, you know, in a way that's a little hard for us to tune into now. It's a little bit, we don't quite have that same heady optimism that they did in those days. But Lem, when he wrote his novel, he responded to that heady optimism with a kind of sobering, pessimistic note, you know, like, hey, everybody calm down, you know. We are not about to unlock all the mysteries of the universe. The makers of the first TV version attempted to do a straight cinematic adaptation of the drama of that book, but they were ultimately forgotten by cinematic history. Andrei Tarkovsky made a movie about being spiritually lost, ambivalent about the whole modernization process, aware that the same wonders of technology that can give us rockets can also give us weapons of mass terror that destroys cities at the push of a button.
Нравственной или безнравственной науку делает человек. Вспомните Хиросиму.
Ну так не делайте науку безнравственной.
That could end life on this planet. I think he saw the danger of that, and the danger of rushing in uncritically to every new thing that we can, to every new thing that science presents us with as a possibility. And he made a very spiritual film, a very kind of emotional film that responds to those problems, as well as being torn between reality and delusion before wondering if there is even a difference between those two things. So then the Soderbergh remake comes out at a time when the Cold War anxieties that shaped the earlier versions of the story didn't seem as relevant. Technological progress didn't seem like it was as threatening to humanity the way that we understand it now. And this is a little bit before even things like global warming had really entered the popular consciousness as like, this is a problem that is here now and that we need to deal with now. There was much more, I think it was seen as more of a settled question. And so in the Soderbergh version, the idea is like the cosmos is benevolent, and the benevolence of the cosmos might be able to save us even from ourselves. And now we, looking back at that, where we live in a world where science itself is going backwards, where it's openly being sabotaged by political actors who see its findings as a threat to their power. So these ideas from the older versions of Solaris now seem more relevant because we now are grappling with this. We now are seeing the ambiguity and the stopping and starting and the ruts and the dead ends, Lem and Tarkovsky seem that much more relevant now to me than Soderbergh's version does. And of course, we're still living in a world where science or supposed advances in science can hurt us, can alienate us. And we are still living in a universe that's much larger than our little minds have evolved to comprehend. But Solaris is simultaneously all of these, even the versions that I don't like. It contains all of these contradictory, cyclical ideas in a Tower of Babel-like monster of half-finished architecture, a story half-told, an ambition of humanity to be greater than itself. It's a story we can't finish in our lifetime, or the lifetime of the next generation, or the next, or as long as humanity itself exists. We can no more get the answers to these questions, the final answers, than we can build a tower that reaches the heavens.